of our dresser build. What we're going to focus on is gluing the web frames into the rabbet and top dado, as well as the shelf in the middle, the bottom dado. So with that said, what we're going to do is I'm going to explain the process and then just show a quick mock-up of how it would go. So with that said, let's get to it. So before I do the carcass glue up, what I have done is I've already glued up the web frame. But let's just cover the process of gluing the web frame before we go any farther. So what you want to do is you want to put 2 clamps, either an I-beam bar clamp or a pipe clamp, between the stile and the rail, putting pressure across the stile. Right? One of the key features is when you're gluing your web frame up, you want to ensure that there is no gap between the web frame and the clamp. If there is, what you'll do is you'll take a hand screw and you'll pinch the web frame down to the clamp so that there's no gap. And when it cures, it'll be flat. If you do not take this one step, you'll have a warped web frame and it'll be very difficult to fit into your project and maybe cause more problems when you come to gluing up the whole thing. So we set this up, let it set it aside for 24 hours. I'm going to put that to the side. So besides that, once our web frames are ready to go, we're going to pre-finish everything. What we're going to do is we're going to take our sides, our shell, and our web frames, and we are going to sand out all the imperfections. So chip marks, pencil marks, glue marks, any types of dents. This is the time to sand them off now, because when we start to glue up the carcass, it's going to be very hard to access any of those things with a power sander or an orbital sander. So we're going to take care of all that now. If you want, though, one little tip, so you don't lose your side pieces, I would recommend writing your name in the rabbet or the dado or the groove of the piece, because those will be hidden on your project, but it'll still be legible so you can actually tell your parts apart from your partners. So once everything's been pre-finished, before I pick up a single drop of glue into these parts, I need to collect my clamps. So I'm going to need 6 I-beam bar clamps, so there's an I shape to the metal, so that makes an I-beam, or 6 pipe clamps. Right? Again, the rule is in this classroom, if you pick up a pipe clamp or an I-beam bar clamp, they have to be the same color if you're going to use them. Right? So again, you can't mix up the red and blacks with the orange and blacks because they are different sizes. So, collected my clamps. I also need some bar clamps, and this is a bar clamp because again, the steel is just a standard bar or bar of steel, and clamping blocks. We need these because if you were just to put the metal on the surface of the wood, it could dent the wood or compress the wood in a way that would dent it, that would ruin the aesthetic of it, or it could actually break the panel. So you're going to need 6 clamping blocks minimum. So with that said, we're all ready to go. I've got my gluing mat underneath. So take my bottle of glue. I'd start with one panel and work to the other. So I would spread my glue in my bottom dado, my middle dado, my top rabbet. Taking my finger or a scrap piece of wood, I want to spread that glue on all 3 surfaces, on the bottom dado, the center dado, and then on the top rabbet. I want to make sure that I get good contact all the way on both surfaces. You know you've spread enough glue when you can still see the wood grain, but you still got that yellow hazy look to it. If you can't see the wood grain, you're going to have a lot of squeeze out. Right? Squeeze out's not a bad thing, but if you don't address it after you've clamped it, or you're going to walk away from your clamped up project, it's better to have a little bit of squeeze out than a lot of squeeze out. So once I spread all those components, I'm going to take my web frame and my shelf. I'll insert my web frame in the front. So I'll put my web frame in, then my shelf piece. glue would spread on this piece, and then combine them together. Right? Then I'll put my top web frame in, and my carcass will look like this. Okay. So what I would start doing is grab a partner, and I'd start from the bottom and work my way to the top. So I take my clamping blocks, and my I-beam bar clamps, start with the front of the case, clamp it down, flip it over, repeat on the rear. Then I get to move up to the middle. This is where a second person would be handy. But I'm just gonna clamp it down. And then for the top, what I can do is I can go on the side like this, squeeze that rabbit in, and then do the same on the rear. Now, the reason why I asked with the bar clamps, what you want to do is you want to compress this top web frame so that it's perfectly locked into the rabbit. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the foot side and you're going to put it on top of the rabbit up here. And you're going to squeeze the top web frame down to the rabbit. So I'm going to put it as close as I can to the rabbit in the corner. If you notice that the middle is bowing up, you're going to need to get 2 more clamps because you're going to want 1 in each corner. And if it still isn't flattened out, you're going to need 1 in the middle. 1 here. Here. Now, this would be a good time to bust out a square and make sure that your cabinet is square. So if you notice that your cabinet isn't square, what we'll do is we have square blocks, and they're basically pieces of wood cut in an L, and we'll clamp them to the carcass to pull everything back to square. So we'll put 1 here and then 1 on the opposite corner. So if I make these 2 opposite quarters square, it should correct the entire case. So we'll do 1, 2, and 3, 4 on the back. The reason why that's important before this sets is that if you don't correct squareness, your case will be crooked for the entirety of it, the project itself. So again, this is probably the most critical step. So again, inspecting, making sure everything's square. The other thing too is if you do have glue squeeze out, resist the temptation just to wipe it with your finger or wet paper towel. let it set for about 10 to 15 minutes till it gets to about a silly putty consistency, and then you can go back with a scraper and cut it off. What's nice about that is it won't leave a stain behind, and it'll reduce the amount of interior work you'll have to do on your project. All right? Now that it's glued up, one thing I do suggest is that, again, write your name in the rear the rear groove of the project, so you don't actually misplace it, or you can write it on the edge, the outside face of your project. Now what we're going to do is we're going to let this sit for 24 hours, and we're going to go over the miter and scroll work. So now that's setting aside and gluing, what we're going to do is we're going to make our bottom filler, front molding, and side molding. Now what's nice is that in our packet, the parts list is set up in a way that it's in order of what we should be cutting. So we should have made our sides before our shelves, then our web frame styles, and our web frame rails. And now we're on to our bottom filler. Right? So the rough measurements for the bottom filler are 3/4 thick by 2 1/4 wide by 15 1/2 long. Right? So we're going to cut to those rough measurements, and then in the packet it says size to fit flush. What that means is that once you cut it to the rough measurements, we want it to make, we're going to have to take off whatever is left over to fit inside of our carcass. Right? The point of the bottom filler is to hold the molding on in the front. So basically you have these pocket hole screws here on the ends and 2 in the center to hold this in place. So basically what we would do is we'd make this part fit, and then after we've come up with our scroll design on the scroll saw, we would cut that design a little bigger on this piece here, then glue and screw it in. All right, you also notice that there's these screw holes here. So you're going to have to do 1, 2, 3 screw holes, evenly spaced and countersunk here. And then for the side molding, you're also going to need to do 1, 2, 3 screws and countersunk. Now in the back here, what we have is our back fillers. All right? So basically, it's the same width as the front filler, but the length can vary somewhere between 6 to 4 inches, cut on a 45 degree. Right? This can be out of any scrap wood you have left over. It's not particularly important that they are, the greatest looking piece, because again, it's going to be on the rear part of the project. Right? So again, this is just for structure, but not that hard to make. So, going back to the front filler. So we make it to those sizes and then trace our scroll work on. Then when it comes to the front molding, it's where it gets a little more critical when it comes to measurements. So the front molding is going to be 3/4 thick by 2 1/2 inches wide by 19 inches long. That's the rough measurement. Now, the final measurement says miter ends to fit. Basically, what you're going to do is you're going to find the center line of that piece, right? Draw your scroll work, and then when we go to miter the ends, right, you're going to come out just far enough where once the center line matches up with your case, when we go to cut this, the bottom of the miter should line up with the edge of your carcass, right? So again, this is where we're going to have to play around with bumping and shaving, right? Because again, we're going to bump and shave until it fits, right? When it comes to the side pieces though, the side moldings, we can cut the miters on these close to the end and have excess hang off the back end of our carcass. Reason why is it reduces the amount of setup we have to do, and we can easily just Japanese saw the ends off once they've been glued and screwed together. Right? The other thing besides scroll work, which is a scroll work is a custom design that is done on the scroll saw. Right? So again, it can be any design you want, as long as it does not take up more than, I think it was 65% of the total width of the piece. And then when it comes to the length, it isn't really limited, except for there's a screw right here. So again, you'd have to work with Ian what the screw holes are. So maybe somewhere in the realm of from center line 3 inches out either direction. Again, totally custom. This one just has a Batman on it, but you are free to do whatever design you want. So once the scroll has been cut and the rear piece has been made, you'll glue and screw the bottom filler in, and then once that's been set, we can mount the molding. All right. One other step too is that each molding is going to need a routed edge, so this cannot be a flat piece of wood. So you got two options. You got what we have here, which is called a taper, or a round over bit. Right? So basically, I'm going to go grab the round over, and I'll show you the profile differences. So taper bit cuts a 45-degree angle on the edge. Round over bit can do this profile or this profile. So this face goes against the project. So we get this profile by running the molding on its edge. We get this profile by running the molding on its face. So again, either one will work. It's just up to you when it comes to the design. One last critical thing, just like the web frame and how they all have to be the same exact thickness, when it comes to doing a miter joint, it is absolutely crucial that all parts involved in the miter joint are exactly the same thickness. So what I would advise is that when you're making your miter joint pieces, that you run them all in the same planer at the same time, or you calculate it out for the rough measurements. You can take it out of one longer piece of wood, plane that piece down to exactly 3/4 thickness, then run that larger board with a 6-step squaring a board, so square up the whole board, and then out of that board cut your exact pieces for that project. So this board here is going to get planed down to 3/4 thickness, squared, and then I'm going to cut those pieces out of it. All right, so what I'll do is I'm going to just plane this down, square up the whole board, and then we'll go and cut to the radial chop saw, where we're going to cut our miter cuts on the piece. Now that I have everything cut to their final dimensions, both in width and length, thickness, width, and length, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the miters. So one thing you need to make sure is when you use a combination square, that you have a very sharp, fresh pencil. Right? You don't want to do this with a rounded pencil. So what I'm going to do is take a combination square, bring it up to the corner, mark my 45-degree angle on both edges. Alright, so I'm going to cut this 45 on this one, and then I'm going to do one on each of these. Alright, so I'm going to zoom in so you can actually see what I'm doing with my hands. Now I have a miter on both edges, all right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to set my chop saw to 45 degrees. I'm just going to double check it with a square real quick to make sure it's exact. There we go. Now I normally swing my chop saw to the right when I cut my miter, because I find it easier, again, since I'm used to cutting with my left hand, I can hold the block with my left hand over here, as opposed to putting my right hand here where the gap closes. All right, do you see how the saw could possibly cut the plane? So instead, I'm putting my hand on this side away from the blade. All right, so now I'm going to cut closer to this side over here. So what I'm doing now is I'm lining it up with my mark, just so it's kissing. So when you finish the cut, it should be a nice sharp edge like that. Now let's just say I don't get a good cut like that. What I could do, so let me cut this one. And it's not all the way to the edge, the end. What I could do is it's called bump and shape. So I'll bump it against the blade, and I'm not pressing it so hard that it depresses the blade in. I'm just making contact. Up and down. And then you would do that until you get a perfect cut. But in this case, I'm going to cut on the line. Perfect. And then just to test it, put them together, and they close nice and tight.
So next time, what's going to happen is we are going to go over how to cut the design in the edges of our mitered pieces for the molding, as well as how we're going to attach it to the carcass of the project. So with that said, have a great day.